everyone, we are Liz and Elizabeth from Simple Simon and Company, and here we are with part 5 of our summer quilt along, where we're going to show you how to take the 4 quilt blocks that you've already done, and you've made as many as the pattern will tell you. Today we're going to show you how to trim those up and finish the quilt.
So the first thing that we need to do before we can put our quilt block together, obviously, is to trim up our blocks. If you don't do this step and you don't trim up your blocks, sometimes your rows can get a little wonky and they can get off. So a lot of people want to skip this part, but this is when we suggest
don't skip
not to skip. So Elizabeth's actually going to show you how to trim up a block.
So usually when I'm trimming up my quilt block, we're squaring all of these to about 10 inches square. I usually just lay it down on my mat, and then I find a good middle ground. So I know that the middle of my block, so I'm starting at 1 and 11, or you could start at 0 and 10, but I just like to move it over towards the middle a little more. So I know that the middle of my block needs to be at the 6. So all I do is line that up. And then the other thing that I do is I take the lines of my ruler and make it perpendicular on my quilt block so that I know I have that squared up, and then I can just trim off all those little extra pieces that need to go.
Now you can see, so I'm going to steal this really quickly, you can see that she didn't trim off very much, but even just that much can throw off your row by a whole 1/4 of an inch. And a 1/4 of an inch doesn't sound like a lot, but visually when you look at it, it makes a big difference.
So I've done 2 sides. I'm just going to quickly do the other 2 sides, and I do know that this side is now square and this side is square, so I can just line up those 2 directly on my cutting mat. Come over and do this last side. There's lots of different methods for squaring up blocks and trimming up blocks, so if you learned a different method from another quilter, feel free to use the method that you learned as well.
People are usually pretty loyal to the method that they learned.
All right, I'm going to stick this right down here so it's a little bit out of our way. Move these scraps over.
Now we went ahead before we started talking today and trimmed up our other blocks. So our other blocks are already trimmed up. Normally what I like to do is I like to make all my blocks from my quilt, and then I will sit down at once and put on a podcast or something that I like to listen to, and then trim everything all at once. It saves time. So we've got all of ours trimmed up, and now we are just going to start putting them together to create the quilt top. Now, if you are making your quilt, like our quilt, then you're going to want to cut some sashing pieces. Now, in between each block, you're going to have a piece that is 5 inches wide by 10 inches long. And it's going to be 10 inches long because your blocks are 10 inches long. So in between each one, we're going to put a piece of sashing. So how I would do this is I would put right sides together, and I would sew down the line all of the way, open it up, and then put my next block on top of it, right sides together, and sew all the way down. Then you'd need one more piece of sashing. So that way you'd have your very first top quilt row finished. Now for the second row, in between the first and the second row, we wanted to do something a little bit different. We wanted to keep this a little bit more traditional, and on a lot of traditional quilts we find cornerstones. Now cornerstones are going to be these yellow squares that are in between the rows and in between connecting quilt blocks. So for those, you're going to cut those 5 inches by 5 inches. So your next row, your sashing row in between your top and your second row, is going to be cut by 5 inches by 10 inches, or your white pieces, and then your cornerstones are going to be 5 inches by 5 inches.
I'm just going to kind of line one up here
so
we can
thank you so much.
Visually see what's happening.
All right.
So here's the sashing piece you already sewed, and then we're going to sew this next sashing piece with our cornerstone piece.
All right. So she's just going to put right sides together and sew that sashing all the way through. While you're doing that, I'm just going to slide this iron out over here. I like the idea of laying it out so we can see it better.
We're just using the 4 blocks that we've already sewn. In the quilt design that's behind us, you're going to need some multiples of some of the quilt blocks. So just refer to the pattern so you make sure you've got all those.
Okay, I'm going to hand you this next piece. And I might slide this up even just a little bit farther. And we'll lay that in here. And you You can kind of see how that this will start to come together.
All right, so we've got our little cornerstone just placed in between our two quilt blocks right there. It just kind of makes for a really nice accent piece. I don't use cornerstones enough. I need to use them more.
They add a fun little pop of color. If like your quilt needs a little bit extra color, cornerstones are always really fun to add a pop of color.
So you're just gonna keep building upon this until you have your whole pattern ready to go for quilting, which is coming up next.
Right, and then on this quilt, just one more thing that we'd like to add before we sign off is that around this quilt we also added a border just for fun. So for me, I chose a red border because I thought the red was a lot of fun. So it's, again, I did the same width as our sashing, so it's just a 5-inch border all the way around the entire quilt. So that's basically it. That's how you put your quilt top together. If you need more instructions, you can always refer to the pattern and that will give you some more step-by-step.